All right, let's dive in. Today we're heading to Long Island. Gilgo Beach. You know, the place that's pretty much become like the definition of a creepy mystery. The Gilgo Beach serial killing.
Yeah, it's a case that sticks with you.
It really does.
Mm.
For over a decade, this thing has just gripped true crime fans, and we're going to unpack all the twists and turns.
And what makes it so fascinating, I think, is how long it went unsolved. For years, investigators, families, everyone was just trying to figure it out, trying to put the pieces together, but it felt like there was no end.
Exactly, right. It's like a puzzle with no solution. And to guide us through this, we're using the 48 Hours, the Gilgo Beach Serial Killings podcast episode. So let's go back, rewind to 2010. We have Shannon Gilbert, a young woman working as an escort, and she vanishes. Poof, gone.
Right.
But it's not like she just disappeared without a trace. There's this really panicked 911 call. She's telling the operator someone's after her, and then silence. Nothing.
A chilling start to the story for sure, and during the search for Shannon, police stumble upon something truly horrifying, the remains of 4 other women. Oh, God. Just awful.
Maureen Brainard Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. They become known as the Gilgo Four, and it just sends shockwaves through the community and beyond.
It's like, you're looking for one missing person and you find 4 others. And the thing is, each of these women, like Shannon, they were all young in their 20s and working as online escorts.
Yeah, and adding to the mystery, 3 of the 4 victims, they were wrapped in burlap.
Burlap, like the kind hunters use.
Exactly. And that detail, it immediately piqued the investigators' interest. Is there a connection to hunting? It's a question they just couldn't ignore.
It makes you think, right? What kind of person would use something like that? It's chilling.
It really is. It suggests a level of planning, a possible familiarity with hunting. But before we jump ahead, it's important to remember that behind the headlines, behind the shocking details, were real people with families, dreams, lives that were tragically cut short. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the investigation and forget about the human cost of these crimes. It's important to remember these weren't just case files. They were daughters, sisters, mothers.
Yeah, and Maureen Brainard Barnes, for instance, she was a mother of 2. Her disappearance devastated her family. Her sister, Missy, has talked about how agonizing those years of not knowing were, and then the crushing blow of finding out what happened to her.
Heartbreaking.
It really underscores the human toll of these crimes.
Absolutely. And then there's Melissa Bartholomew's case, equally gut-wrenching. Her family was receiving these taunting phone calls from someone claiming to have killed her. And not only were they cruel, but they also had clues about where she might have been held.
The psychological torment on top of everything else, those calls, it's like something out of a horror movie.
Terrifying. And I remember reading that those calls, they were traced back to Midtown Manhattan, which is an area where some of the victims were last seen. So there's a potential link there, another piece of the puzzle.
Right. And then we have Megan Waterman. She was a young mother. And her daughter, Liliana, has spoken out about growing up without her, about the void left in her life. It really shows the ripple effect of these crimes, A child loses her mother, a family is shattered, a future is forever changed.
It really makes you think about the lives impacted beyond the immediate victims, the trauma that extends to their loved ones, friends, and even the community. Just a reminder of the lasting consequences of these acts.
Absolutely. And then there's Amber Costello. Her roommate, Dave Schaller, he vividly remembers her last moments. He said she seemed really anxious, had this bad feeling about a particular client who he described as large, imposing.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, because Schaller also mentions a detail about this client driving a first-generation Chevy Avalanche. And it seems small, insignificant, but this detail would later become a major part of the investigation.
Right. It's incredible how seemingly unimportant details can turn out to be crucial in a case like this. And Schaller, he was adamant that this client had something to do with Amber's disappearance.
So we have multiple disappearances, these chilling details, and now a potential suspect. But how did investigators finally make those connections after all these years? That's what we're going to unravel next.
So before we move on, it's crucial to acknowledge the vulnerability of these victims and the societal context surrounding their lives. But now let's really dig into the investigation itself, specifically the formation of this new task force in 2022.
Right, because for years this case had investigators stumped. So what was different this time around? What did this new task force bring to the table that maybe the previous investigations hadn't?
Well, this task force, it was unique. It wasn't just a group of detectives. It was this multi-agency collaboration, bringing together experts from the FBI, state police, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. They basically decided, let's revisit everything, every piece of evidence, re-interview witnesses, start from square one.
So, fresh eyes on the case, but also a wider range of expertise resources. Makes sense, especially given how long this thing had gone unsolved.
Exactly. And this collaborative approach, it led them to uncover some really crucial details that had either been overlooked or maybe dismissed in the earlier investigations. One of those key breakthroughs involved Amber Costello's roommate, Dave Schaller, and his description of that client, the one he described as ogre-like, driving a first-generation Chevy Avalanche.
That detail really stuck with me, too. Schaller was so convinced that this client was connected to Amber's disappearance. It's just amazing how something that seems so small, so insignificant at the time, can turn out to be such a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It really shows the importance of being thorough, meticulous in an investigation like this. Every detail, every observation, no matter how small, it could be a lead. And in this case, Schaller's description of the client and his vehicle, it gave investigators a tangible lead to pursue.
Okay, so they had this description of a potential suspect, a possible vehicle. But how do they go from that to actually narrowing down their search? I mean, Long Island, it's a big place. Finding one specific person, it must have been like looking for a needle in a haystack.
It was a huge challenge for sure. But this is where, good old-fashioned detective work combined with modern technology really came into play. Remember those burner phones we talked about? The ones linked to several of the victims?
Yeah, those disposable phones that are pretty much untraceable. I read that they're often used by criminals to avoid detection. So, how did those burner phones help in finding the suspect?
Well, the task force, they dug deep into cell tower data from the times those burner phones were used. They were able to pinpoint this specific geographic area where most of the calls originated. They actually called it the box.
Wait, so by mapping out the cell tower pings from those burner phones, they created like a geographical profile of where the suspect was most likely operating from. That's pretty incredible.
It really highlights how powerful data analysis and technology are in criminal investigations these days. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Within the box, there was a man who matched Shaler's description and owned a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, Rex Heuermann.
Whoa, it's almost too perfect, like something you'd see in a movie.
It might seem that way, but it was the result of thorough investigation and maybe a little bit of luck. But they still needed solid evidence to connect him to the murders. They couldn't just arrest him based on a description and cell phone records.
Right, of course not. So what was that final piece of the puzzle, what ultimately led to his arrest?
You might be surprised to hear this, but it was something pretty ordinary: pizza. Remember we mentioned Horman had this peculiar obsession with pizza.
Yeah, I remember thinking, that's an odd detail. But I can't imagine how pizza could lead to a breakthrough in a murder investigation.
Well, they had him under surveillance, and they saw him throw away a pizza box in a Manhattan trash can.
Oh, wow.
They were able to get his DNA from that discarded pizza crust, and when they compared it to the DNA profiles they had from the crime scenes, they got a match.
Wait, they got his DNA from a pizza box. That's amazing. That's something out of a crime novel.
It shows that even the most insignificant details can be crucial. The DNA from the pizza crust matched a hair found on one of the victims.
So that was it. The DNA from the pizza box, the cell phone records, the Chevy Avalanche, and Schaller's description, all of that together was enough to arrest him.
It was all of those factors combined. They had enough to convince a judge to issue an arrest warrant. And on July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann, an architect living a seemingly ordinary life in Massapequa Park, was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four.
Wow. That must have been huge for the task force, like vindication for all their hard work, dedication, and for the victims' families, I can only imagine a bittersweet moment, relief mixed with the continued pain of their loss.
Exactly. While Heuermann's arrest provided some answers and a glimmer of hope for justice, it also opened up this whole new set of questions, theories. Remember, there were 10 sets of remains found along Ocean Parkway, some going back even further than the Gilgo Four.
Right, that's what I'm thinking. So they might have caught the guy responsible for the Gilgo Four, but does that mean he's responsible for all of the victims found in that area?
That's one of the big questions still hanging over this investigation. Could there be more victims out there? What other secrets might Heuermann be hiding?
A chilling thought. Yeah. And then there's the question of Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance started this whole investigation.
Yeah, her case is still a mystery. Even with Heuermann's arrest, her cause of death is still debated. Was she a victim of the same killer, or was her death completely unrelated?
It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, and with each layer, more questions than answers. But that's what we'll explore next, the unresolved questions, the ongoing investigations, and the impact this case has had on the victims' families and the community as a whole. We're back, and as we wrap up our deep dive into the Gilgo Beach killings, it feels like, even with Rex Heuermann's arrest, we're left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, it's like we've hit this point in the story, this crossroads. There's relief that a suspect's been caught, but at the same time, the investigation is far from over. We still don't know the full extent of Heuermann's alleged crimes, and there's always the chance there were others involved.
It's not a clean ending, that's for sure. And one of the things that really bothers me is Shannon Gilbert's case. I mean, she's the reason the Gilgo Four were found in the first place, but her story is still so unclear.
It's tragic, right? The woman whose disappearance uncovered this whole web of horror might never get justice herself. The debate about how she died, whether it was an accidental drowning or something more sinister, it just adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complicated case.
And that 911 call she made, it's just so chilling. Her saying someone was after her, it really sticks with you. Even if her death wasn't connected to Heuermann, it just highlights how dangerous it is for women like Shannon working in a profession that often puts them in vulnerable situations.
You're right. It reminds us of the systemic issues we talked about before, the stigma, the marginalization surrounding sex work. It creates this environment where these women are often seen as easy targets, and their disappearances or deaths aren't always given the same level of urgency or attention.
It's just heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, if Heuermann wasn't involved with Shannon's death, are there other predators out there taking advantage of this vulnerability?
It's a very real concern, and that's why investigators are still looking at all 10 sets of remains found along Ocean Parkway, some of which are even older than the Gilgo Four. It's possible, maybe even likely, that Heuermann wasn't alone, or that there are other unsolved cases connected to this area.
This whole place, it's like a dumping ground. It's hard to fathom the scale of the tragedy, the possibility that there are more victims out there waiting to be identified.
It's a sobering thought. It shows that even in places that seem peaceful, idyllic, darkness can exist. And while we hope for answers, for justice to be served, we also have to recognize that for the families of these victims, there's never going to be true closure.
You're right. Catching the suspect, while it's important, can't erase the pain, the emptiness left behind. It's a long, hard road to deal with a loss like this.
And for the families of the Gilgo Four, Heuermann's arrest probably brings a lot of mixed feelings. Relief that someone is being held accountable, anger that it took so long, and just a deep, overwhelming sadness that their loved ones are gone.
I can't imagine what they're going through. Their strength, their resilience in the face of such a horrible tragedy, it's truly remarkable.
And their determination to get justice, to make sure their loved ones aren't forgotten, it's been so important in getting us to this point. It shows the power of not giving up and speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves.
This case, with all its twists and turns, the chilling details, the unanswered questions, it's gripped people for over a decade. It forces us to face the dark side of human nature, the potential for evil that can be hiding in plain sight.
And it challenges us to see beyond the headlines, beyond the sensationalism, to recognize the human lives affected, the families torn apart, the communities living with fear and uncertainty.
So, what can we take away from this deep dive, from exploring such a complicated and disturbing case? It doesn't feel like there's a simple answer, a neat conclusion.
You're right, there aren't any easy answers here. But maybe one thing we can learn is the importance of being aware, of paying attention to even the smallest details, and never losing hope that justice can be found.
For me, it's also a reminder that even in the face of terrible darkness, there's still strength. There's resilience in the human spirit. The families of the victims, the investigators who worked tirelessly on this case for years, they embody that spirit.
And even though we may never fully grasp the reasons behind such horrific acts, perhaps by shining a light on these dark corners of the world, we can learn from what happened and try to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the Gilgo Beach killings. It's a story that's still being written, and we can only hope that as time goes on, more answers will come to light, bringing some measure of peace to those who have suffered the most. Thanks for listening.